For today, we're delighted to welcome Professor Hamilton, who is visiting us from Minnesota. As you can see here, she's assistant professor in the program in the history of science, technology, and medicine, as well as the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, all at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. She is also currently a McKnight Land Grant Professor at the University of Minnesota. She received her PhD in Science and Technology Studies from Cornell University and has already published many articles on related topics as well as this book. She also is an associate editor at the IEEE Annals of the History of Computing, as well as serves in various elected leadership positions for the Society for the History of Technology. So, Professor Tin, we welcome you to Stanford and look forward to your seminar.
Thank you. Thank you for the really kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank Dr. Mo-Fan Liu and Dr. Cameron Eggleston for inviting me and hosting me to give a talk here. And I would also like to thank Shabby for arranging the trip and the event. So today I'm going to present my recently published book, Island Tinkerers. This is an open access book, so you can actually read the book through the MIT Press website. And I'm going to present chapter 8, just in case you start reading. And so this book is a history of computing activities and computing industry in Taiwan over the past 6 decades. I covered this history by focusing on many types of computer tinkerers in Taiwan. And I argue that Taiwanese tinkerers made computers workable, usable, and manufacturable in Taiwan locally. Tinkering with technology was one of the many important factors that prompted the development of Taiwan's computing industry. So the book cover is illustrated by Dr. Matteo Farinella, and I worked with Matteo to include it on the cover the computer products and electronic products that have been kind of manufactured in Taiwan in the past and now. So for example, you can see transistors over here and arcade game consoles. And this is a type of computer memory units, magnetic core memory, cell phones, desktop calculators, and I think this is a semiconductor silicon wafer made by TSMC or UMC in Taiwan. So here is an overview of my kind of outline of my talk today. I will start with an overview of the 3 parts of the book and a little bit historiography, and then I will move on to focus on my chapter 8, which is about Orientalism and tinkering practices in Taiwan. And through conclusion, I would like to emphasize the 2 connotations of tinkering in my book. One is the hands-on experiences. The other is the kind of consistent negotiation with international counterparts, and especially the challenges Taiwanese tinkerers faced in the 21st century. So this is an overview of the book. The book can be roughly divided into 3 parts. First part is about mainframe computers, and the second part is about mini computers, calculators, and electronics components, IC packaging majorly. And the third part is about personal computers. So this is the first, one of the first 2 mainframe computers available in Taiwan through a technical aid program from the United Nations. It was installed in Taiwan around 1962, and this computer was 1964. And in the middle, this is a mini computer built from scratch from graduate students at National Jiao Tong University. And the time period was around 1968 to 1971. This is a computer called Microprocessor Model 2. And the company that made this computer is Multitech. You might have never heard of Multitech. But the company renamed itself Acer in 1987. So this was like one of the early Acer computers. And this is a British Computer Harvest magazine October 1982 issue, the editor of this magazine decided to select 4 of the best computers of the season. And Stan Shi, the founder of Acer Computer, was really happy that his computer was selected, awarded, and featured on the cover of the magazine. So my definition of tinkering is that technology users could adapt, modify, and work creatively with mainframe computers, mini computers, calculators, and microcomputers in Taiwan throughout the history. So I argue that tinkerers shaped the practices of computing in Taiwan and transformed the computer industry with their hands-on experiences. And this is the table of content of my book. I have 10 chapters, and the chapters in blue font on this slide are the first part of the book, which is about mainframe computers. And so I mentioned about the earlier the first 2 mainframe computers were through United Nations Technical Aid Program. And the Technical Aid Program not only brought computers to Taiwan, it also allowed the computer engineers in Taiwan to invite several US visiting professors to teach computer programming in Taiwan and to teach electrical engineering courses in Taiwan. So this is a photo of visiting professors and their family members and their Taiwanese counterparts. This was around 1963, and this is the same IBM 1620 computer that I just showed you on my earlier slide. And Wesley Peterson was a visiting professor from University of Florida, and he was working with 2 Taiwanese computer operators at that time. So through this case, I would like to argue that Taiwanese computer users improvised and tinkered with mainframe computers to ensure this new technology can be installed, used, and maintained in a new environment. So the second part of my book are the chapters in purple font. For this part, I describe 3 groups of graduate and undergraduate students venturing into building mini computers and calculators from scratch. So this is one of the 3 projects. And through this photo, you might be able to sense the experimental nature of the project. And so this was a mini computer that I showed you 2 slides before this one. And it was built by Professor Cai Zhongchuan at Jiangsu University. At that time, he was a graduate student. And on the top is the second computer building project I introduced in this chapter. The gentleman over here is the founder of Quanta Computer. His name is Peng Li Long, Barry Peng Li Long, or also in Taiwan, he's known as Lin Bai Li. And in 1972, he started a mini computer building project, and he wrote his master thesis on his mini computer building project. So this is the cover of his master thesis. So Perry Long is actually the 192nd richest person in the world right now, because in 1988, he founded Quanta Computer. Quanta Computer has been a leading manufacturer in servers and the laptop market. For example, currently, Quanta Computer enjoyed 17% of the market share of servers. And in 2008 and 2020, 1 of every 3 laptops in the world was made by Quanta Computer, because it's a subcontractor, so perhaps you owned a computer from some other brand, but it was actually manufactured by Quanta Computer's factories. So through these computer building cases, I demonstrate that Taiwanese tinkerers aspired to put together a mini computer or calculator by sourcing components ranging from recycled electronic parts to items custom-made at factories. They believed that this was the path that would lead them to acquiring know-hows about mass manufacturing technology. So in the second part of my book, I also discuss Taiwan's IC packaging industry beginning in the mid-1960s. I argue that engineers and factory workers in electronics assembly factories were also tinkerers. Despite many of these factories were owned by multinational corporations, Taiwanese engineers and factory workers utilized their skills to assemble high-quality electronics products. So, for example, this was actually a factory owned by Philco Ford, IC company based in the United States, but they set up a factory in Taiwan, and they were working on black and white TV assembly. So, in the third part of the book, which are the chapters in green font, I discussed the founders of Taiwanese personal computer industry in the 1980s and how they built personal computers by sourcing components made in Taiwan or overseas. I also discussed the semiconductor manufacturing industry in this part. I argue that the emergence of dedicated foundry model in the mid-1980s can be attributed to the manufacturing strength of Taiwan from the 60s to 80s. Taiwan's existing industrial infrastructure, including a very strong IC packaging industry and a booming computer manufacturing industry, was critical to the founding of TSMC in 1987. So here is a slide to just kind of recap the tinkerers, the types of tinkerers that covered in my book. For example, I talk about mainframe computer technicians and pioneering mainframe computer users, mini computer building graduate students, women workers, maintenance engineers in electronics assembly factories, and several engineers turned entrepreneurs and personal computer hobbyists. And so these are a variety of different type of tinkerers in my book. So the concept of tinkering also has another layer of meaning in my book. I use tinkering as a metaphor to describe how Taiwanese historical actors strategically coped with misunderstandings, negotiations, and conflicts when they interacted with their international counterparts. Tinkering as a metaphor allows me to discuss how my historical actors looked for business opportunities, political opportunities, and technical opportunities to bring new technologies and new techniques to Taiwan and to manufacture those technologies locally. For example, my chapter 2 is about the application process of the United Nations Technical Aid Program that I mentioned earlier. And in this chapter, I describe the discrepancy between the Taiwanese applicants and the United Nations Aid Agency officials. So the Taiwanese side emphasized that if we can bring very good quality STEM education to undergraduate courses, then we will have a good industrial development. But from the perspective of aid agencies in the United Nations, they expected to see technical aid can result in a direct or immediate impact on industrial development. So they don't want to only see the implementation of STEM education. They want to see more direct connections, such as internship or sponsored industrial kind of research projects on campus. And so they had to negotiate with each other to carry out this technical aid program. So another case of negotiation was illustrated in my chapter 4. I talk about U.S. military aid to Taiwan lasting from 1950s to 1978. And I argue that the U.S. military aid inadvertently discouraged Taiwanese military personnel to develop their R&D capacity. Therefore, Taiwanese military sectors were slightly behind the academia in adapting computing technology, which is a really different model from the US military industrial academic complex. And so this is where the headquarters of the US Military Assistance Advisory Group was located in Taiwan. So my chapter 8 and 9 focus on Taiwanese personal computer manufacturers as they began to sell their computers around the world in 1980s. And these computer makers focused on making compatible computers. In response, world-leading computer manufacturers, especially Apple Computer and IBM, contested Taiwanese computer makers' strategy. From the perspective of Apple and IBM, they believed that compatible computers were counterfeit products. So that debate generated a series of congressional hearings. And so this is a kind of a transcript of some of the hearings in 1983. And later in the presentation, I will talk more about my observation of the congressional hearings. So my book addresses several kind of big questions in the field of history of technology and history of computing. So first, historians have been studying the relationship between Cold War and the electronic digital computers. Scholars have found that political discourses, strategic military concerns, and social and cultural changes in the United States and in other countries all contributed to each society's respective research and development of computers during the Cold War. So my book looks into the unique case in Taiwan in which the economic competition and military confrontation between Taiwan and the PRC was critical war fronts of the Cold War. So Taiwanese engineers and scientists believed that the adaptation of computers and the founding of the computer industry would be important for Taiwan to perform well on the two war fronts. At the same time, they also strove to maintain a strong alliance with the United States and other countries. So this is one of the many reasons why they aspired to own, explore, master, and manufacture electronic digital computers to broaden Taiwan's business and political opportunities. The second subfield that my book contributes to is to broaden the definition of innovation. Historian of technology Bu Qingdou wrote a book titled Emulation and Invention in 1981. He proposed that emulation as a concept best explained how 19th century inventors, mechanics, and artisans in the United States, such as Robert Fulton and Samuel Morse, used spatial thinking skills, so space-related thinking skills, to comprehend and redesign European machines. So American inventors successfully emulated, not imitated, European machines from a latecomer's perspective. My book offers a historical case that shares some similarities with the 19th century United States history. I chronicle the production of technology from a peripheral location at that time, but I begin the story in the second half of the 20th century. So in my book, my historical actors engaged in a process of technology transfer, but they were not wholesale copying what has been invented in the United States, Europe, or Japan. Instead, my historical actors engaged with imitation, emulation, and experimentation. Their hands-on experience contributed to the success of Taiwan's computing industry. I hope to challenge the dichotomy in which the West innovates and the East imitates. Instead, my cases show that emulation often leads to innovation, and innovation in many cases requires someone to imitate, emulate, tinker with, and experiment with existing technologies. So now I hope to focus on my chapter 8. The chapter is titled Incompatible Computer Dreams, Contested Computer Exports to the United States. And I'm hoping this can illustrate the two layers of tinkering in my book. On the one hand, it refers to the hands-on experiences to build computers, put together computers. At another level, tinkering also serves as a metaphor for me to talk about Taiwanese computer makers coped with misunderstandings, negotiations, and conflicts when they interacted with their United States counterparts and sometimes competitors. So in this chapter, I focus on Acer Computers founder Stan Shi. He's the person over here in the middle of my slide. In 1976, he founded his company Multitech, which was renamed Acer Computer in 1987. In the late 1970s, Multitech focused on importing microchips from the United States and selling them to Taiwanese business clients, including some arcade game console makers. But Multitech also utilized these microchips to design new products. For example, one of its first products was a machine that would allow bridge players to play a game in separate rooms to avoid cheating. And Stan Shi also began to kind of manufacture microcomputers in the early 1980s. So what happened in this time period was the price of microprocessor dropped from $1,000 to $100 per piece. So entrepreneurs around the world can set up their own startup companies and use the microprocessors to design and manufacture different type of electronics products and to export them to foreign, market. And personal computers was one of the best-selling type of products. And a lot of these personal computers utilizing these $100 microchips were intended to be compatible with Apple computers at that time. One of the many reasons was that on the market, there were a lot of softwares and accessories that could be connected to Apple computers. So Stan Shi in 1982 also decided to manufacture Apple computers in Taiwan. But as you can see on my slide, at this time, there were a good number of counterfeit computers made in Taiwan and other parts of the world. For example, this is a green apple, and you can clearly see the icon is different from the Apple computer over here. And this is a Focus 2 computer, and this icon is the wrong one, right? So Stan Shi was aware of that. He made his mind to make compatible computers with Apple, but he carefully discussed with his engineers to make sure that his company would not make knockoff versions or clones of Apple computers. They clearly know that they needed to kind of differentiate themselves from these counterfeitures. So when Stan Shi rolled out the microprocessor Model 2, it was really successful, especially in Australia and in Europe. And I actually have the last copy from eBay of this computer, Harvest Magazine. You're welcome to come over to take a look after the talk. And but now, today, 2026, we all know that Apple computer basically did not allow any compatible computers on the market. We're not supposed to have iPad compatible tablets, right? So Apple Computer's initial strategy was to bring up lawsuits to stop other companies from developing compatible computers. In the United States, the most famous Apple compatible maker is Franklin Computer Company. In August 1982, Apple filed a copyright infringement lawsuit against Franklin. The legal debate lasted for about 2 years. In March 1984, two companies reached a settlement, and Franklin was not allowed to make any Apple compatible computers anymore after that. But for companies outside of the United States, in addition to Following lawsuits in various countries, Apple Computer also worked closely with US Customs to stop any Apple-compatible computers from entering the US territory. So the US Customs will run a similarity test between the code of the imported computers and Apple computers to decide if the imported computers were counterfeiters. So this is a little bit like turn it in. If you teach undergraduate courses, you might be familiar with the plagiarism check, right? So, but the differences is that at this time, some journalists mentioned that we never get to know the percentage of the similarity of the codes that how they do this in the U.S. Customs, and so. It's really hard to tell whether it's an entire counterfeit computers or it's more like a compatible computers type of product. So Apple's reasoning at this time was that counterfeit products made in foreign countries constitute unfair foreign trade practices. In response to this so-called unfair foreign trade practices, the U.S. Congress held several congressional hearings in summer and fall in 1983. And my chapter 8 is about my observation of these hearings and other U.S. media coverage of Taiwanese computer makers. So I have several observations on these hearings and media coverage. For example, first of all, you can see that people in the hearings try to construct a wholesale categorization of all Taiwanese computer makers as counterfeiters. And because of this presumption, they tended to exaggerate the production capability of Taiwanese manufacturers. That way, they could paint a picture of invaders of US market. Second, they painted a picture of a stagnant technological progress of Taiwanese society. And third, in these hearings, some participants associated the circulation of Taiwanese computers and parts with narcotic trafficking networks in the United States. So make it looks very kind of criminalized. And so, but for this presentation, I hope to focus on the misinformation on computer companies in Taiwan circulated in these congressional hearings. By misinformation, I meant that the information about Taiwanese computer makers was sometimes not accurate in these congressional hearings and media coverage. Truthful information was mixed with false information so that the false information could be seen as truthful information. And in this era, we call it fake news, right? So specifically, I would like to share with you some misinformation a private investigator presented when he testified at one of the hearings. So a private investigator was hired by Osborne Computer to tour around Asia in 1982. Osborne Computer Company is an early portable computer maker. This is a portable computer in early 1980s. So the curator, Dr. Hansen Su of the Computer History Museum is actually in the audience. And if you travel to Mountain View, you can actually see how this Osborne computer looks like and actually carry it to see how heavy it is. I don't remember how many pounds it weighs, but it's a heavy one. Yeah, so Osborne Computer, although it looks heavy, although it doesn't look portable, but it was top-notch product at that time. So the company was quite worried about if anyone is kind of doing counterfeiting in Asia to imitate, clone their computers. So they hired a private detective and travel around Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tokyo, Singapore, and other places. And the detective, on the one hand, during the day, collected information about Osborne Computer possible copyright or patent infringers, but he also used his personal time to collect information about other possible counterfeit computers. So by the end of the trip, he was known as an expert of counterfeiters. So on August 2nd, 1983, the private investigator was invited to testify in the third hearings of unfair foreign trade practices. For this hearing, he submitted a 13-page document that listed possible infringers in Asia, and this is the first page of the report. So Acer Computer at that time still with the name Multitech was on the list too. And you can see this is the private investigator's description of the Acer Multitech computer at that time. And you can see Acer Computer or Multitech's address, telephone numbers, telex numbers. And there are a couple of different type of errors in this short paragraph. Over here, you can see the private investigator says that the owner of this company is a U.S. educated and trained Johnny Shi. So there was indeed Johnny Shi in the company at that time, but he was the chief R&D engineer, and he later joined ASUS and is the chairman of ASUS from 1993 to today. So both Johnny Shi and Stan Shi were not US educated. So here we can take a closer look at the private investigator's comment on the company. So, and I quote, "It is reported that Multitech has exported 3 different computer designs to mainland China. All 3 types are known to be used in military applications. Multitech International has developed an IBM PC compatible computer product and is prepared to export that product to Europe and the United States. Multitech International has also produced copies of the US-made DEC computer for export to mainland China. Exact model duplication is unknown, although 2 versions of the counterfeit PDP-11 has been seen." So in this short paragraph, the detective made 2 accusations. First of all, Stan Shi is a counterfeiter. He made fake Apple computers, IBM computers, and DEC computers. Accusation number 2, Acer exported computers to China, and those computers could be used for military purposes. Taiwan was then under martial law, so the trade between China and Taiwan was banned at that time. So the second accusation, ironically, is an even more serious accusation than the first one. It could really potentially get Stan Shi in trouble. So these accusations eventually prompted Stan Shi and his attorney to write a letter on September 12, 1983 to the chairman of the committee that hosted these congressional hearings to refute the allegations. But because Stan Shi was not invited to attend the congressional hearings and the content of the letter was not sworn under oath, so the letter was only attached at the end of the transcript. It was not really discussed in the meeting. So in this letter, Stan Shi clarified 3 things, a list of 3 things. First, he did not break the law. Stan Shi noted that his company imported over 30 million worth of electronics from the United States to Taiwan because Multitech at this time was a franchisor or exclusive franchisor of many US companies, including Zilog, Texas Instruments, and Intel. So he stressed that he was not an outlaw and that he had no intention to become one because he would really want to maintain his relations with US business partners. Second, Stan Shi emphasized that he is not a counterfeiter. His company intended to make computers to be compatible with the best-selling products on the market. So he shared the committee's concerns over the growing trade in truly counterfeit products. However, he was also concerned, and I quote, "In the effort to stop this trade, the distinction between counterfeit merchandise and legitimate products will be lost." So he emphasized that multi-text computers were totally different from illegal counterfeits. Third, Stanshi in this letter clarified that his company did not sell any computers to China, but he did hint that he could not prevent his customers from reselling his computers to China. So at this time, it's possible for someone to purchase a box of computers from Taiwan and export them to Hong Kong, Japan, or elsewhere, and then import them into China. And so finally, in the last part of the letter, Stanshi clarified that instead of Johnny Shi, Stanshi, the undersigned, was the president and chairman of the board of Multitech. So as early as 1982, Stanshi had also joined other US companies to develop and manufacture IBM-compatible personal computers. IBM took a more equivocal strategy towards compatible PCs in the early 1980s, but in 1987, IBM settled on a different course, asking IBM-compatible computer makers across the world to pay royalties for the computers made in the preceding 4 years and thereafter. So IBM sent notices to Taiwanese companies, including Acer, and US companies, including Compaq and Dell, and began negotiating with them individually. Both IBM and Apple made decisions based on their best interest of their companies, but these business strategies seemed to emerge in a context of a systematic creation and circulation of Orientalist images of Taiwanese computer makers. So while the participants in the congressional hearings believed that all Taiwanese computer manufacturers were counterfeiters, this ignorance of other countries' capability to innovate has been elaborated in the field of post-colonial studies. Edward Said's Orientalism illustrates that Western scholars of the Middle East had maintained an unchanging understanding of the Orient from the ancient time to the Middle Ages, from the early Renaissance to the 20th century. The Orient are demon-like, defeated, grotesque, and illogical. But his argument is not only about stereotyping. He emphasizes that even after in-person interactions between the Westerners and the Orientals, it could not remedy and change those stereotypes. So in the case of Taiwan in the 80s, many materials browsed by US media and members of congressional hearings were textual materials. And these written materials only reinforced the impression that all Taiwanese computer makers were counterfeiters and intruders of US market. But the most astonishing similarity between my case and Orientalism, in my view, is that even after many people visited Taiwan, including the private detective and several other historical actors in my chapter, they simply utilized what they knew before their trips to represent what they saw during the trips. Their actual trips to Taiwan did not matter much, as the trips did not serve as an investigation. Instead, these trips served as reification to confirm their impression of the backward island, the Orient, or the cunning copycat. They created paradoxical facts that they believed that they had witnessed. In the second half of the 1980s, clean room was one of the strategies that Stanshi implemented in his company and actively promoted in the industry in Taiwan. In a clean room environment, computer programmers would stay in an isolated environment to make sure that their writing of computer code would not be influenced by their exposure to computer codes written by others, especially their competitors. So I associate this terminology and the practice of clean room to historian Ruth Rogaski's concept of hygienic modernity. Rogoski's research has shown that in late 19th century Northeast China, Western officials, Japanese officials promoted hygienic modernity, but the progress in public health in that area only arrived, and I quote, on the heels of destruction and was established at gunpoint, end of quote. Post-colonial studies scholar Warwick Anderson has also revealed that in early 20th century Philippines, science was used to define the differences between races. In my research, US Customs run a similarity test of computer code imported from overseas in the early 1980s. So this similarity test was precisely a measure to distinguish artifacts created by different peoples. For non-US and non-Western or non-West European countries in the 1980s, a full implementation of copyright or patent protection in their home countries gradually became an important criteria for their eligibility to join international trade organizations. So to make progress in achieving business or political goals, these countries would have to gradually adjust their practices to follow hygienic standards in a clean room environment. Despite these misrepresentations, misunderstandings of Taiwanese computer makers, Silicon Valley quickly recognized Taiwanese computer manufacturers' outstanding R&D and manufacturing capacity. In 1986, after Acer Computer's success in developing a 32-bit computer, Acer and Taiwanese manufacturers became sought-after subcontractors for prestigious computer makers in the United States and around the world. Here is a New York Times article in 1988, and Stanshi was referred to be the Steve Jobs of Taiwan. Acer was also one of the top 10 computer manufacturers in the world in the mid-1990s, and it reached the top 5 computer makers from 2004 to 2014. In 2006, Time magazine published an article written by the former Intel CEO Paul Otellini. And Otellini noted that Stan Shi is a big reason why your PC cost 1,000, not 10,000. So this was another example to see the industry really recognize Stan Shi and the other Taiwanese computer makers' accomplishment. So let me conclude. In 2016, a director, Jason Cohen, made a documentary about Compaq Computer. The name of this documentary is Silicon Cowboys. Compaq was a company that made IBM compatible computers in the 80s. And for the director, cowboy is a really good concept, a useful concept to describe how Compaq Computer founders dared to challenge IBM, the tech giant in the 1980s. Acer Computer and Compaq Computer actually shared a lot of similarities in the corporation history. And the two companies were also fiercely competing with each other since the mid-1980s. But at first glance, the image of cowboys may not seem applicable to Taiwan's computer makers. After all, cowboys are part of the history of American frontiers. So I hope my term, island tinkerers, could be a more suitable description of Taiwan's historical actors. At the hardware level, island tinkerers grappled with newly available but black-boxed computers. They studied computer technology thoroughly, explored the opportunity to manufacture the technological objects locally in Taiwan. Tinkering was also a culture, a mentality, and a set of experiences shared by many technocrats, instructors, students, entrepreneurs, and engineers since the 1960s. And at another level, I use this concept to refer to the ethos of experimentation and negotiation. Taiwanese tinkerers sometimes negotiated, sometimes opposed, and in many cases collaborated with their international counterparts. For Taiwanese tinkerers, these two levels of tinkering have to go in tandem with each other to ensure their success, if not survival. With their hands-on experiences with technology, they started to maintain the technology, make the technology, and eventually sustain their technological business. But they also had to cope with many types of geopolitical challenges over time. In the 60s, they had to deal with the Cold War. In the 80s, they had to deal with the trade war. Similarly, in the past several years, TSMC's founder and top executives strove to make the company's technological capacity relevant and cultivated international support to help Taiwan in deterring potential military threats. TSMC's decision to build fabrication facilities in Arizona in 2020 and the subsequent defense of that decision likely contributed to maintaining and advancing the business relations and hence the diplomatic relations between Taiwan and United States. So I am going to end my presentation here, and here is a QR code for the Chinese translation of the book if you are interested. I also borrow a real copy over here. Thank you so much.
Curious, I guess thinking about the concept of tinkering, so you highlight a couple ways, or at several points you suggest that on some level this is something that's unique to Taiwan, right, from the 60s and onwards, but there's also a lot of scholarship on tinkering kind of as it applies to various other contexts. I kind of wonder, in your talk today, a lot of the points that you highlight, do you think that tinkering as a concept could also be kind of thought about this way in other parts of East Asia, other parts of the world, or are there aspects to tinkering that are really particular to Taiwan? In which parts would you see as particular to Taiwan? Which parts would you see as kind of able to be extrapolated to other contexts?
Thank you. Yeah, so I consider tinkering as a concept to describe this Taiwanese history, the history of technology in Taiwan, especially the computer industry related. But I also feel like it's a shared phenomenon, if not really universal, let's say shared across different cultures. And an example I brought up in my epilogue is actually the underwater robotics competition in the United States nowadays. So in 2004, there was a group of high school students from Arizona inner city high school, undocumented students, and they were able to compete with a group of good teams from top universities, and they eventually got the first prize in the underwater robotics competition. So I found that case and my case had a lot of similarities. People try to tinker with technology in a very kind of resource limited or resourceless environment, and trying to figure out a way to really make technology workable in that type of environment. And I think this is a shared experiences in different cultures and society, and maybe across historical time periods. But what's unique in Taiwan is that these group of tinkerers were luckily, fortunately, highly educated. As I mentioned in the beginning, the early electrical and computer engineering professors, and were really, really interested in bringing kind of top-tier STEM education to Taiwan. And so in terms of this historical development, the contingencies acted upon Taiwan's history was like to bring together a lot of favorable factors to allow these tinkerers to succeed. therefore, that's a unique part of the Taiwan. We can list a couple of different factors over there combined with tinkering. But in the Arizona case in 2004, these undocumented students were actually have to struggle very hard after graduation in order to achieve a better career goals, right? So it's this is kind of a unique case in terms of this historical contingency. Thank you. And the military part of it. So I'm trying to say that from my observation, the military personnel first appeared in my kind of research was that I found when National Jiao Tong University invited American professors to teach computer programming courses and different type of courses, military personnel were sent to the campus to learn computing. And so my question was like, why this is not a typical American story, because American story is military funding founded universities and industries, and so form a military industrial academic complex, and so three sectors grow together, resources circulated with each other, talents circulated, right? And then I look into the documents, biographies, secondary sources, and I realized that my argument is that because of United States military aid, the weaponaries that Taiwan received in the 50s were bundled technological systems. For example, the missile systems that Taiwan was able to receive from the United States would consist of, the radar components or a truck with computers inside, a truck with the missile launcher. So it's all bundled together. So it didn't really create incentives for Taiwanese military personnel to reinvent the wheel to study kind of building computers in Taiwan, because it can come all together and with like really good maintenance services offered by contractors or the military personnel in Taiwan. The military adaptation of computers in Taiwan, ironically, was slower than the Jiao Tong University in this sense. But in my book, I did mention that Zhang Jingguo had a computer sponsored, gifted by CIA in 1963, and that was because the intelligence, networks was thinking about information processing through computers at that time. So CIA arranged a computer, IBM computer, installed in Zhang Jingguo's office in 1963, and some people were trained in, I believe, in either Tokyo or Okinawa by IBM to be able to operate the IBM computer over there. Yeah, sure.
Great.
I have a question is that Taiwan's history, you talk about emulation, innovation. In some ways, it's a great success story, but it's built around supply chain and manufacturing, which means that it doesn't break through sort of the original concept, whether it's iPod or iMac or something, even the GPU that's coming out, right? And that's limited Taiwan's ability to expand beyond that. You go from high margin always down to single digit margins. And that's kind of the sad story of a success story. What does Tinker mindset and ecosystem spell for the next 10, 20 years? Taiwan says wanted to get into communication, wanted to get into software. Those are all failures. And Tinker should be able to do that. Why not?
Was there a question?
Hi, thank you. My question is, I think like Taiwan has very good hardware and we're successful in that. I was wondering why the software doesn't seem to be as successful.
Yeah, so the first question was a question about whether what tinkerers could do in the future 10 years, right? And I would assume it will be pretty much still kind of continuing in terms of the hardware supply to the AI demand. That's my irresponsible prediction offered by a historian. And so it looks like this continuity will persist for a while. And can tinkerers or tinkering mentality change this type of hardware-oriented emphasis? I'm not so sure, but I think this experimentation is an important one for a lot of technological practices, and therefore it needs to be kind of preserved and it needs to be continued. But whether the Taiwanese computer manufacturers or high-tech sectors could really find a very kind of path-breaking way, that I'm not 100% sure. Especially, it's hard to define path-breaking too, right? So Morris Chang retired in, I think, age 87, and he had a press conference to announce his retirement in Taiwan. I think it was like 2017. And then a journalist asked him, like, what is the proudest thing you have done in your career? And then he kind of paused for 6 seconds or even longer. And then what he think of after this pause was actually he believed that his company was a very important kind of contributor to the development of smartphone. Here at Silicon Valley or on this campus, I would say if we do a survey, everybody would attribute Apple as the real kind of Google people realized smartphone. But from Morris Chang's perspective, he feels that his company advanced the manufacturing process in order to make smartphone possible or advanced generation through generation. They started their subcontracting business with iPhone 6 in 2014. And so I guess if we would like to kind of define path breaking, I would still think, speaking from the manufacturer's perspective, they do have some know-hows that didn't really get to know by the general public or even researchers in terms of their standardization of the making of semiconductor wafers, how they make these layers of materials applied on our chips possible. Those experimentation was really a important part of that practices. And they looks like incremental, therefore they don't look like innovative enough or path-breaking enough. Yeah. So depending on how we draw the line between innovation, right? So we can tell a different type of history or success story. Yeah. Thank you for the questions. And yeah, so software. Taiwan, I would say several companies are doing okay or pretty okay with IC design. It's not software, but I feel like that's another aspect that's different from IC packaging or IC wafer manufacturing. And so I didn't write a book about software history. However, I do feel like there are a lot of attempts from the materials I have seen so far. And so I probably don't really have enough information to answer that question. But again, I feel like history was really a contingent one. A lot of uncontrollable factors were happening in the past, right? And then the cluster effect of hardware factories was really a huge one that makes the kind of the sector grow and grow and grow. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, great. Any further questions?
Thanks so much for this great talk. I find tinkering as a concept very inspiring, and I think my question is to continue your question about its generalizability. So I guess I have a few related questions, if I may. So this one is, where do you see the position of tinkering in the spectrum, let's say, from replication, emulation, and innovation? Do you see tinkering as a one occupying a spot in the spectrum. And then a related question is, what are the kind of conditions that would facilitate the emergence of tinkering? Is it because of, let's say, limited access to its original technical secrets or details? Or does it have something to do with motivations, want to save some money, lower the cost of production, etc.? Yes, you get a take on conditions where tinkering is likely to emerge. And also, what kind of expertise is required for someone to be a tinkerer? Like you list a range of different actors who you classify as thinkers. So, what is the kind of, is there anything in common in terms of their expertise? Yeah.
Sure. I should go ahead. Yeah. So spectrum. So I kind of my really implicit definition is tinkering is really including all the efforts that engineers or factory maintenance engineers do before they can really finish the product, right? So I understand the tinkering as a very important activity that includes replication, emulation, tweaking with different type of materials, so on and so forth. And these all together can contribute to innovation. And these all together should be understood as a process of doing innovation. So that's my understanding of in terms of the spectrum you are talking about. And the conditions facilitate tinkering, yes, I think resourceless will be definitely one of them. But in my case, I also found that you really need to have the components to do so. So one of the early computer, so for example, this mini computer built by Professor Cai used components from international, multinationals assembly factory in Taiwan. Transistors people smuggle out from the factory in order to build the computer over here. And he wanted to make his own magnetic core memory, but it was impossible to do it on campus. He really needed certain type of facilities in factory. So he worked with other people in the factory, custom made one for this project. And so the factory that made magnetic core memory for him was the Wang Laboratories. Used to be a very important calculator in the computer makers in this country. And it went bankrupt at some point. And so for Perry Lan, he was not able to have to find a computer memory for his mini computer. Therefore, his kind of DGS or director of the program used research fund in the university to purchase very, very expensive computer memory unit from Hong Kong and imported it into Taiwan. And he also used some recycled surplus electronic parts to build his mini computer. So what I would like to say is in this part of my book, I'm trying to create a kind of electronics abundance kind of phenomenon in Taiwan. So they were able to kind of source components from various type of local market or through networks, black market smuggling from outside of the countries, things like that, in order to make the computer possible. So it's not only resourceless, it's also the presence of international investment in Taiwan at that time really played a role in these computer building projects. So in a resourceless kind of context, you need to be kind of resourceful to really kind of find ways to do things. And I think luckily they were able to do it through networks of the Jiao Tong University alumni. to make it happen. Expertise, yeah. So in this case, a lot of them really have electrical engineering degrees. Precisely speaking, in this time, computer engineering was not a word. So they need to have a certain type of knowledge in order to really do the tinkering project. Therefore, as I mentioned earlier, it was really a group of well-educated tinkerers. And in later time, in the 80s, when you put together your personal computers, I don't think you necessarily need to have a college degree to put together your own computer, but there are also resources like online forums for people to learn how to put together their computers. And so it becomes a culture that you can ask around. In the 80s, you can ask around to see how to build a personal computer through visiting several kind of super department stores in Taiwan, like the Wanhua Market, Zhonghua Market, similar to Akihabara in Japan, or the Radio Row in New York before 1960s, where people would find radio components to put together their radio and fix their radio. So that type of culture environment allows certain type of expertise to circulate among hobbyists in order to do the tinkering.
I'm just wondering how much of this tinkering and supply chain tactics may have been emulated in China.
Yeah, I mean, sort of related to that question, your research, I mean, was there any reason why like Japan or Korea or Hong Kong or Singapore weren't able to essentially go down the path that Taiwan had in terms of, especially with semiconductors, since Japan in the 80s and 90s, there was great concern about Japan overtaking the semiconductor industry.
That was the same question.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Chinese factories invested by Chinese companies, how much of the tinkering innovations was there? Honestly, I don't really know because I've kind of focused my story on the Taiwanese side, but I believe there should be some. One example that I probably cannot really connect it to the Taiwanese part was that the Foxconn's Chinese factories were really faster in terms of meeting the demands from Apple, and then so they had a really flexible, responsive system to handle changes of materials, to source materials for Apple in order to assemble the computer. And so I'm sure Foxconn, it's a Taiwanese company founded by Terry Guo. So I believe there were a lot of kind of cultural or technical exchanges happening in the Chinese factories, as similar to how these U.S. founded factories in Taiwan were able to be experimental lab for people to work together and learn new things from the United States, right? And so I would assume there should be some type of like cultural exchanges, technical exchanges in China, especially those factories set up by Taiwanese companies. And I wanted to mention Shirley Ringer's book, Why Taiwan Matter, and she emphasized that a lot of business practices of Taiwanese companies were actually have a huge impact on the business practices of Chinese companies. So I think the subtitle, so this is her second book or the third book, and the title of the book is How Tigers Were Leading Dragons, right? So her first book was Why Taiwan Matter. And then so she emphasized more on the business practices and the cultures over there. And I'm sure the technical practices should be part of it too. And the question about the path taken by Taiwanese companies, Japanese companies, Korean companies, and Singapore companies in this big picture. I feel like they might all share similar kind of understandings of the environment, right? So if for these different type of companies, Japan might have a larger domestic market that can sustain the economic growth of several companies. But for Singapore, Taiwan, and perhaps Korea, these smaller countries really need to expand their export market. So their challenges is actually even kind of tougher. And so I think I don't really kind of have a single kind of reason to explain how these countries are doing well or they take the same strategies. But you can clearly see that the U.S. aid to these countries, Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, really create a lot of business connections in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I think that matters a little bit to encourage Taiwanese engineers to start their own business and then to make similar type of products a little bit different from their former employees, but to find a way to make money in this very fluctuating, highly labor division semiconductor market. So I think the environment, the small domestic market was really one of the pushing factors for these entrepreneurs to find ways. Yeah.
Great. Well, feel free to come up and talk with our author afterwards, but please join me in thanking Professor Kim.